So you want to know more about Joseph Smith's 1826 trial for glass looking. Joseph Smith, when he went before a justice of the peace in March of 1826, was one of the most consequential moments in his early life. I previously did a video a couple weeks back, go back and check it out if you haven't yet, on early Mormonism and magic, and I talked about this trial in that broader context, but I only hinted at its outcome because I wanted to do an entire video dedicated because I really believe this 1826 trial is both the culmination of Joseph Smith's magic practices and treasure-seeking activities, but also a hinge point in his development to eventually becoming a religious figure. In fact, in my book, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, I posit that 1826 trial represented a rupture, where there is a clear before and after in his development, and I'll talk about why I think that framing is significant. The story is also a bit murky, because as I'll get into, we may never know definitively what the result of that trial was. So I want to give an overview of the trial, the background, what took place, and because this is part of my So You Want to Know More About X series, which I do every Friday, I'm also going to introduce you to some of the key documents, the dominant interpretive traditions, as well as providing you the links and resources so you can read up on it on your own. That's my goal with these videos, not just to introduce you to these topics, but to provide you the background and the resources so that you too can come to your own conclusion. All right, let's dig in. It would be hard to overstate how much what we define as magic and folklore practices and religion were interfused in the early Republic period. These divisions we now have of magic on the one hand and Christianity on the other is an artificial construction that came about later. Many, including the Smith family, did not see a distinction between treasure-seeking, looking into seer stones, scrying, divination, and reading the Bible or praying to God. Although there was a growing anxiety over those issues, what would eventually create that duality of magic and religion, but that was still in tension during the early decades of the 19th century, especially in the area where Joseph Smith's family were raised. In other words, Joseph Smith was raised in a period where there was a deepening feeling of tension between those two worlds that had previously been interwoven, but were now moving in different directions. And Joseph Smith's life actually offers a broader story that many scholars now recognize as these diverging trajectories during the antebellum period. The key part, or one of the major points of intersection between Joseph Smith's life and magic, was, of course, treasure digging. An element that might seem so jarring and distant to us in 21st century, but was ubiquitous, but was common in the early Republic. Mark Twain himself, in his Adventures of Tom Sawyer, once noted that, quote, "There comes a time in every rightly constructed boy's life when he has a raging desire to go somewhere and dig for hidden treasure." And stories of that treasure seeking, including using magical sources to find these treasures left behind by previous colonizers or pirates or adventurers, were quite common in the early Republic, and Joseph Smith fit into that story. Joseph Smith Sr. would claim in the 1830s that he had been hunting for Captain Cook's treasure and just treasure seeking in general for nearly 3 decades, which made him more knowledgeable, according to Joseph Smith Sr., than nearly anyone else leaving. And Joseph Smith Jr. himself was part of a treasure-seeking crew in the Palmyra, New York region, and he soon gained a reputation region-wide for his ability to look in a stone and find lost objects. That crew, that included Joseph Smith Jr. and Sr. and Alvin Smith and several others from the family, would do things like not just look into seer stones, but animal sacrifices, different forms of scrying, using these objects that they believe were infused with spirituality and godly appointed directions, these prayers, these incantations, these astrological figures. All of those fit into this world of wonder, as scholars typically refer to this period. And it's important to note that that's how Joseph Smith's early stories of being visited by Moroni and being told of the gold plates, that's the context in which they were understood. Now, for starters, The first vision, whatever it was and whenever it took place, maybe a topic for, another video. In fact, I have done a previous video on the multiple accounts of the first vision, but however you wanted to find the first vision, that did not mean that Joseph Smith then took a different direction, moving him away from magic. That could be understood within the magic culture. The two things were not seen as, in opposition to each other. And Joseph Smith's own narrative would later say that he would fall back into the follies of youth following the first vision, which is his confession that he still practiced these other magic activities. And Smith's crew were known during these years surrounding 1823, where Joseph Smith first claims have an angelic visitation, to be searching, including on what comes to be known as the Hill Cumorah. So the same hill that Joseph Smith claims an angel told him were buried plates was the hill that his treasure-seeking crew were trying to find ancient riches. Some of the earliest tales, the earliest narratives through which Joseph Smith's neighbors understood the gold plate story and Moroni were in this context of treasure seeking, with a number of details that would later fall out of fashion as the Moroni story turns into more of a Christian story than a treasure seeking story. And then after Alvin Smith, the oldest Smith son and Joseph Smith Jr.'s older brother, died, Joseph Smith told others that the person who was going to accompany him to the hill, first it was going to be Alvin Smith, but after Alvin Smith dies, it was going to be Samuel Lawrence, someone else who was part of their treasure-seeking activities, which seemed to signify that they understood those gold plates as part of those treasure-seeking endeavors. And that would result in that treasure-seeking crew expecting a share in those gold plates when Joseph Smith would eventually claim to retrieve them years later. So all of that background is what brought Joseph Smith to Bainbridge, New York, and Harmony, Pennsylvania in 1825 and 1826. By the way, if you enjoy this kind of nerdy content, I hope you are already subscribed to this channel. If not, rectify that problem now. I try to do 3 videos a week, deep dives on particular topics on Monday, connections of past and present on Wednesday, and then my So You Want to Know More About X series every Friday, where I peel back the curtain and talk about the historical interpretation, introduce you to sources, as well as talk with some of the leading scholars of American religious, political, and Mormon history about their latest work. And every first Wednesday of the month, I hope to do a live discussion on the YouTube channel with where I can answer your questions. And if you want to give back, please consider becoming a member of the channel. I'm so grateful for that so many of you have taken that plunge and supported the work that I and my wonderful producer Anthony do. It's because of your support that allows us to continue putting the time to do these videos that do these important topics justice. All right, let's go back to the 1820s. After the Smith family had a good few years in the early 1820s, and they seemed to finally have their life in order, they moved into a new home, they had taken out a mortgage, they had built the home that the Smith parents had long sought after, they had a really rough stretch. Their oldest son, Alvin Smith, who was in many cases the breadwinner of the family, the engine, the person who held the family together, especially when Joseph Smith Sr. was not as reliable due to his own personal activities and due to his age. When Alvin Smith died, the family spiraled. They did not pay their mortgage payments on the home, and they were prone to losing it, and the Smith family was becoming desperate. It was at that point in 1825, so a couple years after Alvin Smith's death, that Josiah Stowell, a rich farmer in nearby Bainbridge, New York, reached out due to Joseph Smith Jr.'s reputation for being a seer, and invited Joseph Smith Sr. and Jr. to join him on a quest to discover what he believed to be a silver mine left over by Spanish explorers. They promised to not only share the proceeds of the hunt, but that he would put him in contact with other people who would buy the Smith family's wheat, which would provide them a economic staple going forward, and maybe provide the family the financial resources to keep their home and not fall once again into poverty. And we actually have the agreement for this treasure seeking, although there's a caveat in the nature of the agreement. Here you have it. Here is the agreement. Now, you may know it's not a manuscript source. This is coming from a newspaper. While the agreement was signed on November 1st, 1825, the earliest version we have appeared in an anti-Mormon newspaper in April 1880. over 50 years later. So what do we make of this document? It outlines that they were going to share their proceeds, what they aim to do. It had the number of participants signing, including both Smiths. It also has Isaac Hale, the father of Emma Hale, signing as a witness. The first record we have of this agreement's appearance is earlier in 1880 when the Susquehanna Journal, a journal from the Harmony, Pennsylvania region, said that they had come upon someone who had these documents and they published it. Then the anti-Mormon, at the time, the anti-Mormon Salt Lake Daily Tribune took that record and published in April 23rd, 1880. We don't have the Susquehanna Journal version. That was lost because, like many newspapers of the time, they weren't preserved. But can we determine the veracity? Well, there are a number of reasons why the text of that 1825 agreement do check out. Most importantly, according to the Joseph Smith Papers scholars, who are the best diggers into this period, there are enough textual clues from the document itself that reflect other sources that we can verify from the period. I mean, Joseph Smith's own history, Lucy Mack Smith's history, all talk about going on this treasure hunt with the Stowells in 1825 to search for a Spanish silver mine. That's all in the record. And further, the commentary surrounding that agreement in the newspapers in 1880 are, yes, full of anti-Mormon material that isn't actually in the agreement itself. In other words, the argument is, and I find this argument persuasive, if this agreement was a forgery, if it were created, it would include a lot of the items that those anti-Mormon figures wanted to include in the agreement instead of the straightforward information it does. So that's why most historians take this 1825 agreement as likely reliable, even though it's not published until 1880. That's why the Joseph Smith Papers Project published it as an appendix in their document, saying we can't 100% verify it, but it does seem real. What is clear is that treasure hunt failed. It was a bust. Within just a couple weeks, Joseph Smith apparently told the Stowells that he could no longer see the treasure, so they disbanded. The Smith family lost their mortgage on their home. They were allowed to remain in it just as renters, and Joseph Smith himself probably felt a bit guilty because it was in part of his growing reputation as a treasure seeker that had caused some of the financial problems for the family. So these were dark moments for Joseph Smith Jr. And then on top of that, in March of 1826, Joseph Smith is then sued by Josiah Stowell's nephews, who accused Joseph Smith of swindling their gullible uncle. It is interesting to note that in their lawsuit, it was Joseph Smith Jr. who was charged and not, say, Joseph Smith Sr. or the other adults involved, which goes to show Joseph Smith Jr.'s own reputation for seerhood. And it's also an example of the anxieties over magic and religion at the time. One nephew, Peter Bridgman, would later become a Methodist exhorter, representative of the new generation who wanted to distance magic and religion. And the law that they were drawing from, a New York state statute, represented this new Enlightenment era, which assumed that all claims to using seer stones to find false objects was wrong, was false, was a swindle, which is why Joseph Smith was charged. So let's talk about what we know about the trial. We know it took place in March of 1826, and the justice of the peace was someone named Albert Neely. And in his receipt for payment from the state for his duties, he called the trial the People versus Joseph Smith, the Glass Looker. That was his payment record, and there was one other official member as part of the trial who also issued their payment record, and those are some of the only contemporary documents we have. The problem is, as I'll get in, those documents do not contain one of the most important elements, and we'll talk about why that might be. Now, Joseph Smith was charged as a disorderly person for claiming to use a seer stone in the search for treasure. The New York statute, as I mentioned before, was meant to convict anyone who was, quote, pretending to discover where lost goods may be found. And if found guilty, Joseph Smith would then spend 60 days in jail. The payment receipts report that there were 12 witnesses who spoke at the trial, including those on behalf of Joe Smith and those against. The nephews of Josiah Stowell claimed that Joe Smith was a swindler, representing this growing sense that the magic was fake and does not fit the new Christian enlightened world. Josiah Stowell himself, though, testified in reaffirming his belief in Joseph Smith's abilities. So this is one of the ironic twists in the story. The alleged victim testified on behalf of the alleged criminal. Joseph Smith himself testified he seemed genuinely scared in his remarks. He admitted that he used a stone through which he could find hidden treasure, so he didn't back away from that, but he insisted that he had left that behind. He says that it hurt his eyes, but in general, it seems like he was embarrassed and he wanted to reform his ways, which I think should give us a sense of how it ended, which I'll get to in a bit. And here's the most important matter that gets lost because it's not included in the payment and contemporary documents. We don't know the result of whether he was found guilty or innocent. As I mentioned before, this is a tricky case with conflicting and missing documentation, and the original court docket book is lost. Although, as I'll get into, there are some hints on what that record might have been. Now, I want to emphasize that one of the best overviews, which gives you links to the documents themselves, which I'm going to introduce you to, comes from the Joseph Smith Papers Project website, especially their overview and introduction to this court case, which they call the State of New York versus Joseph Smith. I will include the link to this in the video description. So there are generally three possible outcomes that scholars consider for what might have happened in that March 1826 trial. The first is he might have been found guilty. It appeared a pretty straightforward case. The state statute said that if you are pretending to find lost objects, you are guilty of being a disorderly person. That, in many ways, is actually the result of some of the witch trial fights in the period, and I'll give you a link to an article on that later. There are some early newspaper accounts that seem to imply that Joseph Smith was guilty, though those are anti-Mormon accounts from the early 1830s, so we can't take them as gospel. And then one of the most important documents, if you were to make the argument that he was found guilty, was a later published version of the docket entry that says Joseph Smith was found guilty. Here is that account. Note again, it's not the manuscript copy. Instead, it was published in a newspaper, an anti-Mormon newspaper at that. Here's the backstory for this document. The docket book from that Justice of the Peace Neely was allegedly passed down and eventually fell into the hands of his niece, who just so happened to be a Methodist missionary to Utah, who was trying to convince people that Mormonism was a sham. She was trying to bring them over to Methodism and what she saw as pure Christianity, and one of the ways she did that is emphasize Joseph Smith's early occultic practices, which showed he could not be a true practitioner of Christianity or a true prophet. She allegedly excised the pages from her uncle's docket book, shared those pages with people as evidence, and eventually excerpts from those pages were published in the anti-Mormon newspaper Utah Christian Advocate in 1886. Now, unlike, say, the 1825 agreement, which was also published in an 1880 anti-Mormon newspaper, there's material in this entry that is not fully corroborated by contemporary evidence. There seems to be material in it that seems to directly mean to support the anti-Mormon argument, which is why scholars aren't 100% confident in the veracity of this alleged recreation of the docket book that says that Joseph Smith was found guilty, which is why some come out and say that Joseph Smith was actually acquitted based on the lack of evidence. It is possible. Some have made that argument. I'll give you some links to scholars who have made this argument that the judge ruled that because Josiah Stowell himself claimed that he was not hoodwinked, that he was not fooled, that the judge might have determined to throw the case out. Maybe he didn't have enough evidence. And most importantly, perhaps the best argument in favor of Joseph Smith not being found guilty is that the judge's itemized bill, one of the itemized bills that were kept and that we have from 1826, includes, we have a charge for this, we have a charge for this, we have a charge for this, but there is no charge for an acquittal, there's no charge for a guilty, a conviction, which there would have had to be according to state statute at the time. And further, there is no record of incarceration, which would have been the penalty had he been found guilty. The other evidence for Joseph Smith not being convicted is the reminiscence of a guy named William Purple, who claims he assisted the Justice of the Peace Neely in the 1826 case and published an account of it based on what he claimed were notes that he kept on behalf of Neely in 1877. Here is the document. Again, it's appearing in a later newspaper published in 1877. Much of his account overlaps with what is said in the other docket book entry that was published a decade later, except for one key difference. This one says that Joseph Smith was acquitted based on not enough evidence. And there were other Latter-day Saints who gave reports of this, who said that Joseph Smith was honorably acquitted. So again, there is conflicting and later reminiscences which we can't fully square. But there's also one final possibility of what might have happened. So what do we do with these conflicting testimonies and accounts, and especially squaring the fact that it seemed like a straightforward case? Joseph Smith claimed to be seeking lost treasures. The New York State statute made it clear that that was a crime, but it also seems that he was not convicted given the contemporaneous document. Well, that brings up one third possibility that a number of scholars, including myself, have mostly adopted, in that the judge took pity on Joseph Smith and he stayed his ruling, meaning saying, I am not going to find you guilty. I'm not going to acquit you. I'm going to stay the ruling in return for you improving your ways, acting better, a way to, improve a juvenile delinquent. And Joseph Smith was 20 years old at the time. This would make sense why there seemed to be a clear-cut case, but he was not convicted, allegedly. It would also make sense why some of the earliest accounts of this trial say that the judge condemned Joseph Smith, but did not convict him. This might have been a way that the judge, like several judges at the time, would stay a ruling in hopes of reforming the individual. This was a whole judicial philosophy at the time of reforming the penitent, instead of throwing them in jail and adding a conviction to their record. It also might explain why, in 1830, when Joseph Smith is visiting Bainbridge again, he is arrested on charges that scholars still don't fully understand why, but it's possible he was arrested again on these charges back from 1826, in which the justice said that you did not fulfill your end of the bargain of giving up your treasure-seeking ways. So, to summarize, there is a possible interpretation, and I find this the most likely, though far from definitive, that the judge told Joseph Smith, I am not going to find you guilty. I'm going to put a stay on the result of this trial. In return, you give up your magic-seeking ways and you become a better Christian. And that's why I think that this trial ends up being quite consequential in Joseph Smith's development. You see, I argue that 1826 was a clear hinge point in Joseph Smith's life, where there is a definitive before and after, including how he viewed Moroni and the gold plates story. There is a common narrative, especially within those in the LDS faith, that there was a slow evolution, a pathway to prophethood of Joseph Smith transforming from the treasure seeker to the prophetic seer. I don't see that. I actually see an abrupt rupture. I see three things taking place in 1826, which fundamentally shift Joseph Smith's activities and worldview. The first was the trial. I think Joseph Smith was terrified. I think Joseph Smith felt that he had to change his ways, otherwise his family's going to be in problems, given the financial difficulties, and he's going to be in legal issues as a result of the scrying and seeking. The second major issue is that same spring, there were a series of Methodist revivals in the Palmyra region, and there were contemporary accounts of Joseph Smith catching religion, taking place in those revivals, now seeing himself more as a Christian seeker rather than a treasure seeker. And third, coming out of that Harmony episode where Joseph Smith stayed with the Isaac Hale family, he fell in love with Emma Hale, and he wanted to win over Emma's family, including her father Isaac Hale, who was not a fan of those magic activities. And according to Isaac Hale, it was after the trial that Joseph Smith told Isaac Hale that he was giving up the glass looking, and that he told Emma's siblings that that trash thinking, that was nonsense, but what I'm doing now, bringing about these gold plates, is real Christian stuff. And so that's why I think the gold plates and Moroni story evolve. Now from this point on, the person who's going to accompany Joseph Smith to the Hill Cumorah is not Alvin Smith, because he died. It's not Samuel Lawrence, who is part of his treasure-seeking circle. It is now Emma Smith, representing this new respectable, responsible Christian approach to those plates. It's a story of Christian America rather than a story of lost treasure. The old treasure seekers are now cut out of the process, which what made them so mad when Joseph Smith claimed to retrieve the gold plates and he was not sharing it with the others. But I will emphasize the Book of Mormon story itself is still going to evolve over the next few years, but I think is now evolving on a distinct trajectory from what it was before that moment in March of 1826. So to summarize, this is a complicated story, and we may never know the full outcome of what's going on. Please feel free to add your theories in the comments and let me know where you think I'm wrong. It is very possible that my interpretation and other scholars' interpretations is just informed speculation, because we may never fully know what happened in that courtroom in March of 1826. But when placed within the broader context, I think we can make some reasonable interpretations. Now, I want to close this video highlighting some of the great scholars who have done work on this, who represent this variety of interpretations. And I will link to all of these. First and foremost, the Joseph Smith Papers Project, their website contains many of these documents and Herculean interpretations. Even when I might disagree with some of them, I do them at my own risk because I think they have dug into these sources better than nearly anyone else. If you want an apologetic take that tries to make the firm argument that Joseph Smith was acquitted, Gordon Madsen published Being Acquitted of a Disorderly Person Charged in 1826 in a BYU Studies volume titled Sustaining the Law. I will add a link to that in the video description. Perhaps one of the best diggers and most influential interpreters is Dan Vogel, whose both biography of the early Joseph Smith, The Making of a Prophet, as well as his multiple series Early Mormon Documents, captures a lot of these documents and interpretations, which I think are worth engaging. And if you want the faithful but kind of nuanced account that looks at Joseph Smith as a gradual transition toward prophethood away from treasure seeker, again, an interpretation that I disagree with, Richard Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling is, of course, one of the best examples of that. And if you want the broader context of how this trial fit into the broader debates over magic and folklore and enlightenment and witchcraft, Manuel Padro's article, Cunning and Disorderly Early 19th Century Witch Trials of Joseph Smith, published by Dialogue Journal of Mormon Thought a few years ago, is absolutely wonderful and a good starting point, and I will link to that in the course description. I hope this video at least provides you some background to understand what was going on so that you too can come to your conclusion. I hope it also demonstrates why history still matters today, because these foundational stories are complicated, but they're stories that I think we have to wrestle with, which is what I aim to do with these videos. If you found this video, please hit the like button, share it with others so we can broaden the discussion, and stay tuned because I got more fun videos on similar topics like this coming up.